Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Urban Fae, Banshee in the City, Part 4, by Bearlair64. I made my way up to the front door. The porch lights were on, and there were some dim lights inside that glowed merrily out into the gloom of night. I had noted that there was only one car under the carport. Unlikely that both the ladies would be present. As I reached up to knock, I heard a loud thump behind me and whirled to see the big black cat with the white splotches on his chest. He stared up at me with his inscrutable feline gaze, green eyes burning into me, perhaps with a message. I shook off the feeling and turned back to knock when I heard the interior lock disengage and the door opened. Sorsha, coppery locks wild as ever, stood in the doorway and looked at me, puzzled. "Rob? What are you doing here?" Her surprise would have been warranted had I made a routine call on her without phoning or texting ahead. Yet I knew she was a fake, a liar. "Are you seriously going to pretend you don't know?" I asked in a polite enough but slightly menacing tone. She shook her head, her eyes sparkling wide with curiosity, and lips parted in stupefied wonder. We stood looking at one another, neither quite sure what to say. I saw that she now wore a sweater, some loose flannel pants in purple plaid, and slipper socks with a university logo. The silence had begun to grow towards an uncomfortable tableau when the big cat growled loudly from deep within its chest and broke the spell. Sorsha looked down at her pet. "Tom, be polite to our guest. You know we must." I shook my head. The oddness of the situation had me off balance. "I thought his name was Tim," I said stupidly, changing the subject rather than forcing a challenge at the moment. She frowned, and a tear threatened to leak from her emerald orb. "Poor Tim. The night of the memorial service for Dad. I found him the next day. Then Tom here appeared, just like in the story. Though I buried Tim, rather wait, for the 6 cat pallbearers." I had looked up the story on my phone during one of my bus rides since she mentioned it. The last time I'd visited her home. It was short and a little silly. It involved talking cats that bore a casket and told a man to tell his cat that Tim Tildrum is dead. He did, and his cat Tom proclaimed, "If Tim Tildrum is dead, then I'm the king of the cats." It was an old story, a kid's fairy tale. I shook my head in disbelief. She was foobarred in the head. I was sure of it. While I cogitated, she made a decision of her own. "Come inside, it's cold. You too, if you like, Tom." I shrugged and stepped inside. I removed my antiquated headwear and found that it made a great object to twirl nervously. Tom apparently liked the idea of the interior of the warm house and scampered past my legs. His back brushed me just above the knee. "Maybe he is bigger than a lynx," I briefly mused. Sorsha retreated towards the interior room, but called over her shoulder, "Mom should be back soon. She went to visit the Hearns at the hospital, and then to church to light candles for them. I'm just writing a paper for school. Would you like something to drink?" So there I was, inside the home, the lair of this washer. She played the role of the innocent very well, and I was sure she intended to lure me to take a drink of poison or find some other means to murder me. I gripped the handle of the big knife, then changed my mind. It might be too large for the task at hand, so I selected the claw with my other hand. I didn't draw it. I just wanted to be ready for anything. "Sure, thank you," I replied, and decided to play along rather than challenge her. I'd observed too many strange occurrences in the past month to take anything for granted. I know I was unexpected. Did you and your mother take separate cars to the hospital? She paused at the kitchen and had begun to dig in the refrigerator, but stopped and looked up at my inquiry. What do you mean? Mom went alone. I have to get this paper done. I've been here all evening. I stared for a moment. So you weren't at the fount? At the hospital? She rose and handed me a cold bottle of water, the seal of which was still intact. I took it, and she beckoned me to the small breakfast table. It was so similar to my meeting with Makta that I became instantly suspicious. I waited for her to sit before I did. I set the bottle on the surface of the table, placed my hat beside it, and took the chair opposite hers. Look, Sorsha, I know it was you, washing Mr. Hearn's old shirt. You walked into the hedges and sort of faded. Sorsha shook her head, scarlet locks tumbling around her lovely face. I haven't been near the hospital. Why don't you tell me from the beginning? I decided once more to play along and related the events of the evening. Maybe your mother will have something to say. The two of you were together in the lounge. I thought that you must have ridden together. She reached across the table and placed her hand on top of mine. The appendage was warm and soft, comforting. Careful, I cautioned my mind. Rob, I don't know who you could have seen, but it was not me. Mother was alone, I assure you. Could it have been one of the other family members or the hospital staff? I didn't want to say that there couldn't be two as lovely as her. That would have sounded so lame. If it wasn't you, then it was your doppelganger. There was a rattle at the side door, and shortly Mrs. Gosling bustled inside. Ah, Rob, I thought that car outside belonged to the Hearns. We really didn't expect you this evening with all that's happened. Her eyes misted as she spoke. She was a woman who showed her emotions easily. I rose and clutched at my hat. Good evening, Miss Ellie. I didn't mean to surprise you. I just wanted to catch up with Sorsha for a moment since we didn't get to visit at the hospital. Mrs. Gosling smiled. I see. Well, I should have told you that she couldn't come. Her paper will be overdue, and she doesn't like going to church with me. Sorsha gave me an I told you so look, while Mrs. Gosling continued her bustle on into her home. I sat down again. I'm sure I looked puzzled. Sorsha picked up my water, cracked the seal, and handed it to me. So whom did you think was at the fountain? The washer? I thought hard about that question. I could think of only one person who appeared to have otherworldly or fae qualities. It may have been Siobhan. I don't know her, but there's something about her. She wasn't there when I returned to the lounge. She could have been somewhere, maybe even back at their hotel room resting. Not sure. Sorsha simply stared at me as inscrutable as had the cat. Anyone else? Maybe someone you've seen or known in another capacity? She pointed to my hat. Were you wearing the leather diadem? I shook my head and sank once more into my reverie. The only other person I can think of is dead, killed by an otherworldly creature. I only picked up the hat tonight, so I haven't been wearing the diadem. Not really my style. Sorsha shook her head in mild frustration. My dad died to get those gifts to you. You should have found a way to wear them. Have you even looked into what each one does? It was my turn for a headshake. I felt stupid. It wasn't like me to avoid reading and research, but I'd wanted action. I knew she'd never understand, so I equivocated. I haven't delved into the material. I needed to take care of something first, and in doing that, I discovered that I have regular world freaks out there to get me as well as otherworlders? Fae? Anyway, I won't set it aside any longer. I like to read and study, just a matter of finding the time. She eyed me dubiously. All right. Well, I'll get you started. Dad found duplicates or made copies of what he gave you. He must have known or at least suspected that you'd need help. The diadem helps you pierce through glamours, illusions cast by the Fae. It's the way they disguise themselves, especially when they travel in the mortal realm. You can learn to see on your own, at least with creatures and beings who wear glamours the way we wear clothes. But the diadem will help you see past the most powerful of glamours cast by higher beings. A caution, it doesn't work for glamours cast by beings who have that ability as part of their nature. Now, what about the belt? Is that in your style catalog? She asked with more than a hint of condescension. I was getting a little frustrated at her tone, since I was the one who came here to question her, but I'd come to feel that she was trying to help, besides the hat face. Yes, I've been wearing it under my shirt. I lifted, said a barrel, and peeled down my pants just a bit to display the hairy fashion faux pas. Any idea what it does? Sorsha nodded in mild approval, the opposite of her earlier expression. It helps you cast a glamour. You may eventually learn to cast them on your own, but that one is your default. With just a little concentration, it will immediately shift your appearance. I'm not sure to what. She had already noted the torque and now pointed to it. The torque is more mysterious. It may offer some protection during a fight, or it may offer luck in obtaining wealth. Usually two-sided, though. What the torque gives, the torque can take. So be careful if you decide to use it. I nodded. So, how do I activate these things, these gifts? She sighed. I refuse to do everything for you, Coyote. Dad wanted you to do the research. It always works best if the person most affected does the work. I just wanted to ensure that you knew that each of these objects were valuable, not just the weapons. Have you figured out how to activate the light on the big blade? I must have assumed a pretty dull-witted look, since she almost laughed at my discomfiture. Seriously, Coyote, Dad always bragged about how smart you were. I saw your conversation from that last night. You boasted about getting through high school ahead of the curve and already having some college. It would be impressive for a mortal, but still a little lazy by Fae standards. I sat up and asked, so why do you keep implying that I should be up to Fae standards? She looked stunned for a moment, and then some knowledge seemed to dawn within her. You really don't know. No one ever told you, and you have not inferred it through your adventures? I gave her the blank talk to me stare. Coyote, Rob, you are of otherworld, as were your parents. She let me absorb it for a moment, then placed her hand, that oh so lovely hand, over mine. I could tell she was finally ready to give me a break. I'm sorry, Rob. I didn't think about it. Your parents would have held off telling you for as long as possible. Dad knew. I think he wanted to tell you in person. Not sure why, but he told me the morning before he died. Caught me reading one of the duplicates of your books. I wouldn't have taken him seriously, but we can discuss why I did later. Do you want to hear it, or wait to see if Dad included the story in his notes to you? She didn't wait for my answer. She could read me at least as well as she'd read the books. It's a short tale, don't worry. There are likely details that you want to know, but this is what I have. Her eyes rolled back for a moment, as if to access a memory as clearly as possible. Then those emerald orbs flashed into mine, penetrated my wretched brain. Your mother was a washer. She was assigned clothing and armor to wash for Fae warriors as a warning of their impending death. She would often keen for them as well as for their companions. Pardon the pun, but the waters get muddier. Your father was a war band leader. They were already married when her cruel mistress gave her your father's clothes to wash. Some say she meant only to allow your mother the honor and to give her time to prepare herself for the loss. Others that she was a cruel being and wanted your mother to suffer. In any case, your mother hid the clothes and convinced your father to accompany her to this world. Some called it Mundania. Her mistress must have eventually tracked, or more likely had them tracked where they died. You were born here, so until recently, the Fae did not know of you. It was Mr. Hearn's choice that brought out who you really are. She paused to let me absorb what she'd said so far. I couldn't. Not really. I had a vision of who my parents were, and she'd just shattered that. I turned to a different question. Mr. G? She smiled. My family has some Fae ancestry. In fact, Dad's father was a minor, a being who liked to seduce mortal women. In Otherworld, he served in your father's war band. He eventually abandoned my grandmother. The Fae take many forms and tend to have short attention spans when they visit this realm. It was quite a scandal, but her family sheltered her. Mom's Fae ancestor was further back and was a female. Her mortal husband broke a gaze, and she had to leave him for Otherworld, never to return. Anyway, when their bloodlines crossed, one of their children was bound to inherit the Fae genes. That's why you find me so irresistible. I was a little surprised at her last comment, but I had to face it. She was right. I took a chance and turned my hand, the one that was covered in the soft warmth of her own, upward, so that I clasped her fingers in mine. She gave a gentle squeeze, so I felt the need to continue the conversation. I've read about gays. They're kind of like a curse, a prohibition or an obligation that if broken or not met means an or else, a nasty consequence. She nodded and smiled in approval. Right then I determined that I'd do plenty to elicit that smile. Okay, enough mush. It was getting late, and Ms. Ellie made a return appearance, now dressed in a robe with her hair in curlers that clearly hinted that it was time for guests to leave without saying it in so many words. Sorsha and I exchanged goodnight courtesies, and I stalked out into the cold and dark, Tom having fled ahead of me as soon as the door opened enough for him to squeeze past my legs. He quickly disappeared into the darkness that matched his fur. I fished out the car keys before I made it to the little sedan, and I kept close watch on the enveloping darkness. An exterior light illuminated my path, a straight line to the driver door. I knew that to follow the light was sometimes safe and sometimes a guide to one's doom. Then a twinkle at my periphery caught my attention, and I turned to see a soft blue glow. Out in the yard, outside the pools of light cast by the electronic lights of the house. It was an amorphous blob, almost an orb, but hazy around the edges. It emitted a barely audible hum, a pleasant sound, downright mesmerizing at the volume increase and the complexity of the melody arose. The light danced and bobbed and started to move away from me, out into the night, towards the lake. I followed, drawn by the beauty of the music and lured by the thought of the welcoming light. A loud hiss and broke the spell, and I returned to my senses to find Tom sitting at my feet and glaring into the darkness where the light had danced. I had on my hat and the diadem, so there hadn't been a glamour, at least if what Sorsha had told me was accurate. Yet there had been something, perhaps a natural illusion. I shook my head and decided it was time to head home, to the Hearn home. Thank you, Tom. Unless you need something, I'll be getting along home. Oddly, I did not think it was so silly to address the cat as though he would understand me. Somehow I knew that he did. He gave me a dismissive glance and blink of the eyes that I interpreted as, "You may go." So I did. My mind raced, but I kept the car at or below the speed limit and drove cautiously. I didn't feel like getting harassed by Johnny Law. As I neared the Hearns' house, I saw a telltale yellow-orange glow, topped by a billowing black column that rose to meet the dingy glow in the night sky, cast by the city lights below. Sparks from a house fire, rather than stars twinkling in the sky. My heart lurched and then plummeted to my feet. I instantly felt heavy, and my breath grew short as once more I saw my home go up in flames. The fire department was on the scene, and since the house was small, they quickly had the blaze under control. Lucky me, I got to speak with Lieutenant Falk while the firefighters cleared the scene. "So, Mr. McIntyre, where were you tonight when things got interesting?" I was experiencing what I knew to be the feeling of having my heart wrenched. It seemed I had learned so much about normal human behavior in the past few months. I answered in what I could tell was a dull tone with just a touch of, you guessed it, wistfulness. I was at the hospital, and then I went to visit friends over in the Lake District. She smirked, clearly missing that I was in shock and upset. "Well, you certainly have a range of friends, from over in the Rat's Nest to Lakeside Lovelies." She paused to see whether her snark had any effect. It normally would have, but I was starting to get the numb feeling that comes after the initial rush of emotions at a precipitous tragedy. She took my silence as cause to continue. "Do you have contact information for the Hearn siblings? They will want to know that the same murdering thugs who shot their parents have now torched their parents' home." I blinked my way back to near-conscious thinking. "You mean some hood rat crew did this? Why? They have no reason to pick on the Hearns. Wouldn't they know that everyone was at the hospital but me?" Ding, 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 ding. I'd just won the prize for being the biggest idiot. Look, I know some shady characters, but they have no reason to do this, just to get at me. I wonder if they know what happened to my I cut off the last. I was truly in shock to be babbling aloud in front of the popo. The smirk returned to her hawkish features. "Yes, I looked into your background and saw what happened to your parents. Were you gone that day as well? Seems to be your M.O. I was now back to fully conscious and getting angry. I was barely able to contain it and grated out, "Are you trying to goad me into saying something stupid, or are you simply a total jerk? In any case, Lieutenant, if you continue, I will file a complaint. You see, two can play that game, and police aren't exactly flushed with friends these days." Her smirk turned into a grin, a very toothy grin. "I merely wished to awaken you from your melancholy state, my dear boy. It looks as though the fire department will be wrapping up soon. Perhaps you'll be able to retrieve something from the ruins once the sun rises. Only a few hours till then. I'll submit my report. The fire marshal will be out soon. I'll recommend that it was indeed set deliberately and that you were the intended target through some unknown slight you committed over in the Badlands. You have enough problems without the police getting involved too deeply. With that, she turned away and went about her business. Far-minded wench! I watched forlornly as the fire department indeed went over the now black and crumbling mess that was so short time ago a warm and welcoming household. I doubt that there would be anything salvageable. I was glad that I'd taken my treasures, but the books had to be destroyed. So I thought, as the early morning light, I picked through the scarce remains of the wood-framed house. I found what had been my room and the bits and pieces that had been the dresser, the one with clean underwear and socks. Well, there, with the crumbling char and ash covering most of its now gleaming surface, rested the case. It had impossibly made it through the conflagration. While everything else cooked and melted, the little case had sloughed off its plain exterior to reveal a shining surface that looked healthier than it had before the blaze. Surprisingly, the contents were intact. All the books and notes Mr. G had prepared were in place. I called Bart and let him know what had happened. He was naturally upset, and he and Colleen came over in less than an hour. I passed on what Lieutenant Falk had said about it being the same crew that had shot up the place the previous night, and I confessed that they were likely after me for unknown reasons. I had apparently transgressed some gang taboo. They were both too shocked to say much. I helped them search the ruins and salvage a few pieces and mementos. The fire had been pretty complete in its destruction. They agreed to let me use the car until they figured out what to do. No, there had been no change in the mister yet. He had made it to the morning, and the doctor seemed to agree that he would soon turn a corner in his recovery. I asked if I could stay with them in the family lodge at the hospital. I'd have to first go get some fresh clothes, but I suddenly felt the need to protect Mr. Hearn. He was, after all, the Hearn. He had enemies that were far more deadly than mere mortal gang turds. As the son of a war leader, it was my duty to protect him. I never thought I'd feel a sense of duty. I really had been corrupted by my experiences. Bart and Colleen headed out to their own homes to take care of various domestic tasks, and I determined to head towards the outlet mall on the other side of downtown. I could get on the loop and go around the traffic, but it was so much shorter to cut through the Badlands and the nice downtown folks. I made it as far as MLK and traveled the border between Jaguar and Sony's territories. I couldn't imagine that anyone would recognize the car unless they'd followed me. As that thought crossed my mind, I slowed to stop at a red light. A golden-colored SUV with reptilian scales painted in realistic 3D rolled up beside me, and the darkly tinted windows began to roll down into the doors on my side of the vehicle. I was about to be shot up and murdered. I glanced to the other side and saw that no cross-traffic was too close to the intersection, so I floored it. The back driver's seat window shattered, and rounds thumped into the rear quarter panel and trunk lid. The thunder of automatic fire was loud and sudden, but faded quickly as I outpaced my new friends. I had the jump on them. They had to wait for the cross-traffic I'd avoided to clear before they pursued me, and I had a chance to accelerate the pitiful 4-cylinder engine halfway down the next block before their 8 cylinders roared in triumph and reached my side of the intersection. The light ahead turned yellow, but I already spied my new route. I braked suddenly and turned down an alley. It was a risk, but I didn't have much to lose at the moment. I dodged past several obstacles and eventually squeezed past a parked car at the end of the alleyway. It opened onto a one-way street in the direction opposite that I'd been going, so I crossed onto the alleyway on the far side. Once I got through, I could resume my drive. I checked the mirrors several times. There was no way the big SUV could get through the alleys. I was now grateful for the small vehicle. It had allowed my quick and easy escape. I turned onto the next avenue that allowed me to travel in the direction I desired, as I rolled through the light at the next intersection. I passed them. They sat patiently and watched me cross in front of them. "Fubar!" I shouted. They anticipated my move, or at least thought to go in the same direction and hope for it. The new crew leader must recruit smarter thugs than had Jaguar, though his taste in vehicle paint jobs was similar. So, still a tasteless turd. Once more they pulled in behind me and accelerated. I made it through the next 2 traffic lights, the poor engine getting hot with the strain I put on it. The ugly Golden Snake SUV stayed inches from my bumper the entire time. We were in the outer parts of downtown. The lights would soon become less forgiving. As we approached the bridge and acted as the border in my mind, I concluded that there was only one hope. I slammed on my brakes and let them hit me. They were bigger, but the little Hernmobile was already ruined, so might as well go for it. I pressed on the brakes, and fortunately they applied their own, so that soon we came to a stop. Had they thought to accelerate, they could have shoved me off the bridge. I held my hand on the seatbelt release before the screeching, smoking tires halted their skid. I opened the door, dove out, and scrambled to the rail of the bridge. I didn't have time to look before I leaped, since 2 large and heavily armed goons stepped out just a split second behind me. I was airborne even as they started firing. I felt the lurch in my chest at the absence of a platform on which gravity might work. My pulse roared in my ears as I plummeted about 20 feet and landed in the water. I dove and swam as hard as I could upstream to get under the bridge. The water was too murky and polluted to open my eyes for more than brief glimpses, mostly involuntary. I saw the trails of projectiles as they struck the surface and plunged around me. I felt a burn as one brushed my left calf. Not bad. It still seemed to work. But with what horrors would my bloodstream be attacked in this filthy environment? My mind, as usual, was a little distracted under pressure. I felt the tightness in my chest that signaled the need for oxygen. I set my feet in the muddy bottom and stood. I blinked open my eyes and saw that I had made it under the bridge. I was temporarily safe, but in dire need of a place to flee. I heard the sounds of gunfires from both sides of the bridge and saw little splashes where the gangsters fired at random, like tiny depth charges, in hopes of finding me and making me a corpse. I looked in each direction, then saw my pathway and a beam of light that broke through the shadows cast by the low banks. A culvert, a big one like the last one that had nearly led to my demise. Better the foobar you know than the devil you don't, I thought ruefully. I could hear voices up on the bridge and sirens in the distance. The thugs argued whether to climb down and search for me or flee before the popo arrived. I made my dash for the dubious escape route of the culvert while they argued. I didn't run. That would have made too much noise. I almost made it without them noticing. One of them yelled at me, "That's right, water rat. We shot your house. Now we're gonna shoot you." The time he took shouting could have been better applied to taking aim. By the time they realized my destination, I'd reached it and plunged into the darkness of the city drain. I heard rounds strike all around where I'd been, and curses and shouts followed me. Maybe they'd been more lucky than bright in catching up to me. The sirens grew closer and the shouts ceased. I stayed where I was, hesitant to trespass further into the underground. Who knew where or when I'd emerge or what I might meet? I strained to hear what transpired on the bridge above. "Faux bar," I hissed into the shadows. I just realized that I'd left the case and my bowler in the car. Just as well. I'd have lost them in the sinking river. I decided to reveal myself to the officials on the bridge and beg for sympathy and understanding when a hissing laugh sounded from within the sewer tunnel. It was a familiar sound and sent shivers through my spine. Yet this time I was armed. I drew my blades and peered into the murk. I could see the glowing eyes approaching. swaying slightly with the slithering of the body behind. Either it was larger than I recalled, or close. I realized in horror. My hands were wet with water and a little sweat, so I pushed the pommel of the fancy blade against my chest to help adjust my grip. The rubbing resulted in a flash. I tried it again, and after a few passes against my sternum, the pommel, shaped and carved like the true orb in the sky, lit with a silvery white glow like a celestial model. It was bright, like a truly full moon, and I could see the eyes pause, and the hand with long, sharp talons go up to protect them. I stepped forward and slashed at that arm. I felt the blade penetrate and flesh part. The creature shrieked in pain and fear. Then the light from the moon pommel touched the wound, and the being literally recoiled in agony. It would have been a good time to flee back into the morning light at the other end of the tunnel, but my blood was up, and I recalled the tracks at Mercedes' murder scene. I owed this monster, and I was going to slaughter her as she had killed my friend. I was sick and tired of people and beings trying to kill me. She struggled to back in the tunnel and attempted to turn. I stepped forward and struck the back of her head with the pommel. I had hoped to get her to face me and fight, but instead she coiled her body and hung her head. She raised her good arm defensively and hissed, "Mercy, my lord. I surrender." I was shocked enough that I paused. My arm quivered and raised to stab the long blade into her throat. I would not normally have hesitated, but a quality in her voice struck a nerve. I wondered briefly whether it was a mind trick, like a serpent's gaze that halted its prey. But she spoke again. "I am but a servant, my lord. I do what I wish until I'm giving a task. I'm compelled to obey. It's my nature and the curse of my kind. I bear you no ill will." I kept the blade in place, aimed and hovered over her now vulnerable gullet. "Who sent you?" I hissed out in turn. She groveled even more. "My lord, my master, I cannot reveal the name." She all but wept in fear. I had no pity. "Who all have you killed to hurt me?" "None, my lord. I was only meant to distract you, to keep you busy and grieving for your lostness." She paused as to leave me with an unsatisfying answer, but I hefted the blade and flicked my chin in encouragement. "My lord, only the woman at the place of loud and ugly music. I've killed no others in my duties regarding you." Of course, I didn't believe her. What about Mr. Gosling? He was out near the lake. Surely you could have slithered that far. You're a big girl. She shook her head, a mannerism completely at odds with her appearance. "No, my lord, I know of no baby Gosse that required a death." I shrugged as best I could while keeping the point of my blade on target. "If you won't tell me who sent you and to what purpose, then I may as well kill you." "Wait, my lord," she shrieked, hissed. "I told you I was sent as a distraction and to lure you back to your old haunts so you could be more easily disposed of." I thought for a moment. "So you expect me to believe that you serve a mere mortal and a low-life criminal at that?" She stared at me, for the first time losing some of the fear induced by the silvery light. "Of course not. The new leader to replace the one the Lord of the Hunt took is no mere mortal. His enterprise offers many more opportunities to feed appetites among certain of the Fae, especially the dark Fae. My attention turned inward for a moment, and she struck with her good hand. I managed to partially block the strike, but her talons raked across the top of my chest and tore through the flesh. I felt them scrape on my ribcage and sternum, even as I counterattacked. She dodged the lunge that I had kept so diligently pointed at the same target for too long, but in doing so exposed her eye to the point of my blade. It entered the socket, and she cried out in mortal agony. I stepped back, bleeding profusely and prepared for a fight to the death. Yet she twitched and squirmed, and her enormous coils seemed to shrink. She grew smaller until her humanoid parts were no bigger than a standard human female, and her coils receded completely. Her eyes wept a thick black ichor, something like that which had spilled from the chasers. She now gazed up at me. "My lord, apologies again. I must plead my nature. You have won. I serve one called Serpentine in the mortal realm. He is powerful in both Otherworld and in Mundania. He tends to build an army of mortals for the wars of light and dark, order and chaos. Mundania can be a dangerous place for the Fae. The Otherworld stuff always amazed me. So many situations were illusions, and so many beings like to play tricks and lie. Yet some had to be taken at face value. So, do I have to look over my shoulder every time I take a stroll in a storm drain? I inquired more calmly than I felt. She smiled, less hideously than she had on our first meeting, her fangs having melted into sharp, but mostly human teeth. "My Lord Coyote, if you cross into the Otherworld, must always remain cautious. It is a dangerous place. Yet you will have no further strife from me. I must now return to Otherworld for good, or perish here in Mundania." With that, she turned and walked sinuously back into the darkness, her wounds still weeping, but healing as she blurred into the next intersection of pipes and exited Mundania. Mine, however, had not begun to heal. The flow of blood had slowed to a seepage, but I was in great pain, so I made my way back towards the fading sunlight at the end of the tunnel. It was now late afternoon. I peeked out and saw the traffic flowed normally on the bridge. I had either stepped into the Otherworld, or at least the threshold. Time had elapsed in an idiosyncratic way that it had during earlier trips. I hoped that it was at least the same day. It seemed silly, but I asked a passing stranger for the time and date. He recoiled in disgust at my wet, reeking personage and blood-soaked clothing, but when I pressed him, he told me. It was late afternoon, the same day, as I dared hope. Before I let him escape, I asked for directions to the nearest emergency room or medical clinic. He pointed down the street in the direction opposite that which he had headed. "Down that way, buddy." He paused. A modicum of decency bubbled up from somewhere inside him. "Do you want me to call an ambulance or something?" I thanked him, but shook my head. "I'll make it." I wasn't sure that I would. I was getting awful dizzy and weak. The bleeding had stopped, but the wounds on my chest were hot, fevered, and swollen. I was in a bad way and must have looked it. I began the long stumble down towards where the man had pointed. As I passed the first narrow roadway between buildings, I saw that the shadows within were deep too deep. Fubar, I thought, as the ground rushed up to meet me. Something's gonna eat me. So quoth this raven. My darlings, all together, what do we do when we see a will-o'-the-wisp near the lake? We don't follow the lights. It seems that Tom is a good king. One more part in this chapter of Coyote's story. I will probably put all 5 parts together next time with a timestamp in the description, so we can have the whole thing together. Anyway, my thanks to Bear for this lovely story to share with you all, and I hope you all have a beautiful Thursday. Bye-bye, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.